Hello, Matt.
Hey Graham, nice to see you.
Good to see you. Welcome, everyone, to Crazy in Love, the podcast where two therapists talk about relationships. Matt, our last podcast episode was called Great Expectations. We
Yeah,
focused on big expectations of relationships. I think maybe the working title of this episode is something like Modest Expectations. We're talking about today therapy, couples therapy, but more broadly, how small changes, modest effects can have a really quite profound impact in someone's life, right? Kick us off. Why are we talking about this today? What's kind of stoked your thinking on this?
as a few things. I think people come to therapy sometimes with very inflated expectations of what they might want to achieve, in the way that I think people go to the gym in January with inflated ideas of what they might want to achieve, or they set out on a diet or fitness regime or whatever it might be. And often what we're talking about in life is a bit dull, isn't it? But often what we're talking about in life is incremental improvements. We're talking about that sort of idea of maybe marginal gains across a few things. And then you and I think that that's usually like massively helpful in terms of health. Some focus on calories in and calories expended, on the quality of the food we eat, on the sleep we get, and whether we bother with the gym and how often we bother with the gym. Those things actually do show up, even though you might not be living in the gym or always eating clean or never treating yourself or never kind of going off the rails. And I guess it's the same in therapy, right? You can do quite a lot with relatively little. And the reality is, some people settle into therapy and stay for a very long time, and good on them for doing so. But a lot of people don't. And particularly couples tend to come, get some relief or get some help, and then go again. And I can end up feeling a bit disappointed sometimes that people leave. I want them to stay and do more. And I think we're only partway through it, or we've only just begun. But actually, that was what they wanted. They wanted, I suppose, what you might call minimum dose. And there's nothing wrong with that.
But are we thinking though that they might come to therapy and come to couples therapy, maybe wanting more than that, but actually the minimum dose, the kind of modest interventions and modest effects actually represent something worth having done? And maybe that's where a lot of people kind of draw the line and say, actually, that was really helpful, maybe more helpful than I realized in terms of these minor tweaks, and I'm happy to leave it there.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like the gym, that you go with very big intentions. You realize how bloody hard it
I want to
is.
get ripped.
Yeah, and how much effort is involved in that. And then you're like, do you know what? I'll
Yeah.
go 3 times a week for like 20, 30, 40 minutes, and I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
And if that's all you did, it would show up. Like, that
Yeah.
would be significant, right? That is not nothing. That is more than most people are able to achieve. So I guess I am saying two things. I don't want to be confusing, but I think, the big ambitions to start with, a realization that actually this is very hard, and then maybe in terms of how difficult it is to do and to achieve, something more modest is useful to have. And in couples therapy, it's often that ability to talk through something which previously had tripped you up and caused you to argue with one another, or become furious and misunderstand one another, or at your worst, self-conceive for days, or feel thoroughly fed up with your partner and
Mm.
disengage. And some tools in therapy might just get you through that conversation, and that then might be enough for people. So some couples, and individual therapy works the same way. I think some people stick around. They're like, this is good, this is really helpful, I've got time and I've got money for this, and I'm kind of enjoying this in a weird kind of way. I'm getting something from it, a bit like you get something from the gym. It's not always that enjoyable, we don't always want to go, but you usually feel better afterwards, and you certainly get a benefit.
We're in a world, aren't we, where it's quite prevalent to see people selling transformational effects.
Sure.
I was listening
Yeah.
to a podcast today where part of what they talked about was the mental health and physical benefits of drinking hydrogen infused water, and they were talking about how there was this guy on another podcast who was involved in the manufacture and promotion of this type of water, who was trying to sell it as this transformational
Yeah.
impact in
Yeah.
your life, when of course hydrogen infused water, if it's going to benefit you at all, is going to benefit you around the margins, right?
Yeah.
And I think sometimes therapists in the world of therapy sell transformation. They sell self transformation and self actualization, and this idea that we're going to take you from someone who is quite unhappy, quite anxious, and we're going to transform you into that person you've always wanted to be. And I think that that is a potentially dangerous way of approaching
Yeah, completely. I completely agree. Yeah,
individual therapy or couples therapy. We're not here to transform people's lives. We're here to gently nudge in the right direction, I think, in the main.
yeah. I think it's be yourself with more skill, isn't it? I think the science on personality suggests that you can stretch and you can move
Yes.
in different directions if you are less than conscientious, as your default, you can be more conscientious in certain types of job and certain types of situations, but there is a default and a pullback to sort of what you are
Yep.
generally like. And I suppose for me, it's working with the grain of that. I think those changes are sort of, I don't want to talk in riddles, but I think conversely, they are quite big and quite
I
significant.
agree. I
And
agree.
I sort of I get what you're saying with sort of gently nudging and those kind of things, but I also think it's transformational change. In a relationship where you argue about everything, or you can't get on with one another's families, or you can't have a sane conversation about your finances, current or future, and then that changes. That for me is a significant outcome and will require quite a significant amount of effort.
I agree strongly, and maybe it's a kind of semantic issue, right, around what we mean by
Sure.
transformation.
Yeah,
But
sure.
I've worked with some couples. I think I've mentioned before in a previous episode where one intervention along the lines of the moment that you are starting to try and persuade your partner of your point of view,
Yeah.
you've already lost. Just give it up.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Move away from the conversation. Have another go with a different technique, and
Yeah.
that intervention has not transformed their relationship, but has certainly moved it to a place where they can live way more in harmony with each other and avoid the kind of pitfalls of useless, pointless arguments,
Yeah.
repetitive arguments where they hurt each other. Now,
Okay.
I wouldn't necessarily see that's transformational, but it's massively helpful for their relationship and turned their relationship into one that they both enjoy being in, as opposed to one that they're thinking about getting out of.
I think both things are right. I think you could legitimately describe that as transformational. And my other beef, I guess your beef is with therapists overselling stuff. The thing you mentioned a minute or two back, and maybe coaching falls into that kind of category even more so. I think there's some rogue practice in that area. I think therapists are sometimes the other way. They're too quiet about what they do. They
Yeah.
sell safe space, or they sell confidentiality, or they sell a listening service, rather than we're going to change something substantial about your life, a way in which you behave, or a way that you approach or think about a problem, and it will show up in a really significant way. So I think, I mean, I'm totally with you in terms of what you're saying, but I also think it needs to be described in that way for some people, because it does get you a significant outcome, and it's quite a lot of hard work on the way. I think as well. I was playing table tennis with my youngest son this morning, and he said it's so difficult to hold the bat like this. I was telling him they needed to hold it slightly differently, and it was just a very honest reflection. It is so weird and so peculiar if you hold the bat like a handshake, and then you're told to adjust the position of your hand so that you're imparting more topspin on the shot. It is so weird and so wonky, and so many of those shots go wrong that you're kind of going to give up quite quickly. And I was saying to him, that's why people in the world of sort of tennis coaching, that's why people can't hit a forehand topspin shot, because it's so peculiar the way you hold it. You don't hold it like a handshake, which opens the racket face and balloons the ball up and is a much less effective shot. So I think there's quite a lot of technical stuff to do within couples therapy. Like, you're going to have to do something differently. You're going to have to listen much harder, compute what is being said to you, play that back, acknowledge that, try to build on it if you can, and then counter if you need to with something. But that won't be what couples come to therapy doing. They'll be doing the exact opposite of that. They'll be defending their position, drilling down into why they're right and why their partner is wrong. So it is, I think those things can feel like quite big changes, quite significant changes, quite difficult changes.
Yep. Yeah. Even if from the outside looking in, that couple are probably still spending most of their lives and most of their time doing the same stuff that they were
Sure.
before they went into couples therapy. I guess that's
Yeah,
the difference.
absolutely. Yeah. It's
You're
so
not
difficult to
transforming
judge
a
other.
life. You're not transforming a relationship in that sense.
Yeah.
You're tweaking it so it is more amiable, more affable, that people can get on with each other and that they can have the conversations, sometimes difficult conversations that they might need to have, that a lot of
Yeah.
couples might be avoiding because they explode into arguments whenever they try.
It'll look the same, won't it? You'll still be driving the same car.
Exactly.
You still be living in the same house. The way you go on holiday won't change much because of that. But I think the stuff within it will change. We say this a lot. Maybe I say it a lot. I tend to talk to people who've done well in life, reasonably materially affluent. Some people incredibly wealthy who I talk to, and that's not the kicker. It's not the thing that makes you happy. It's not the thing that is determining of whether your relationship is satisfying and fulfilling for you. So nothing will necessarily look different in your material world, but it will look really different. I see lots of people who've made it financially and professionally who are deeply unhappy in their lives and in their relationship. That's the bit of transformation, isn't it? You're in that head, you're in your mind every minute of every day of every hour, and the minute you go and talk to somebody else about something and they're in their head and we tend to clash, that if that starts to dominate the relationship, then I think it's very difficult to be happy in an unhappy relationship.
Yes, I really resonate with that idea of kind of you're in your own head in an unhappy relationship a lot of the time, aren't you? One branch of this conversation I wanted us to explore was that focus on the self. That I think again the world
Yeah,
of
right.
therapy sometimes really promotes a focus on the self and this idea of self-actualization and self-happiness that I think can get in the way of the kind of work that individuals and couples might need to do to actually end up being less unhappy. Let's maybe explore that for a bit.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I would do nothing more than than agree with you in that instance. I sometimes say to couples, you've both got to go first. You've both got to step into that listening. You've both got to suppress that kind of habit which hits back or defends the position. You've got to try and open up and acknowledge what's being said to you. You get your chance to counter. You can absolutely challenge what's being said to you. You can give it from your point of view. But if no one is willing to listen and acknowledge the other person's point of view, we just can't go forward. And that is a kind of turning outwards, doing something for somebody else.
Yes, how that feels like again could be a kind of small change. This idea of shifting your mindset or shifting the lens through which you're seeing the relationship from one where I myself want to get everything that I want and need from a relationship to one where you're thinking about the collaborative relationship. What are we trying to achieve? How do we get to
Yeah.
where we want to get to? It's a slight shift, isn't it? It's a modest, uh, just
Yeah.
shift in perspective,
Yeah.
but can have
Yeah.
genuinely massive changes, both in terms of practically how often do you argue, what are your arguments or conflict discussions like, but I think also just how you feel in a relationship can feel fundamentally different. You might feel less resentment about having to clean up, for example. If you're seeing it as a collaborative effort, you might feel less resentment about doing your fair share of the parenting if you're seeing it through that lens, rather than thinking, I'm not getting my needs met, and I now need to go and do the dishes, and now I need to go and spend my time looking after the kids.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a there's a comedian I saw on social saying something like it's not self-care if you cancel the plans we had to go see a film at the last minute. Actually, you're being kind of selfish. And I think that's worth saying back to people sometimes, within a relationship and as the therapist. It's like
Mm,
we can overdo that self-care thing, can't we? Actually, one of the ways in which you care for yourself and really improve the quality of your life is turning outward and doing things for other people. You can overdo that. You can be too self-sacrificial. You
mm.
be a martyr to that. You can always be putting somebody else's needs first and then feel resentment. So there are caveats on that, but by and large, if we try and tune into what somebody else is saying to us and connect with that and do something for someone, it usually feels pretty good. And also then you get your go, don't you? You get to say, and this is how it feels from my point of view, and you'll do me the same courtesy of listening. You'll play back what you think I've been saying. We'll get that right, and that feels good too. I think it's quite quickly a virtuous circle. It's the bit of therapy that is I think really nice to unlock and kind of, to some extent easy and rewarding and motivating, but it's quite difficult to get there. I think it does require a shift out of that more self-interested point of view.
Mm.
Often see people come in and they're both battling to tell me that the other person is wrong and that they're right, that they're the more reasonable partner. And that is the thing that I would want to just name and sort of draw a line under immediately.
Good, good. You've been reading a book that you wanted to maybe draw on a little bit in the conversation, that
Yeah,
particularly this idea of kind of change and modest change. I think just to
yeah,
set the framework, maybe we haven't quite done the strategic kind of groundwork around how I often think about therapy in the context, or couples work in the context of the world of medicine and health more generally, and how actually the effects of the vast majority of interventions in the world of health are relatively modest.
yeah,
That,
sure.
that doesn't mean that that's a negative thing.
No,
You tweak pain around the edge to take pain from a 9 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10. In
yeah,
studies, won't reveal itself to be an enormous difference, but makes a big difference to you on a subjective
yeah,
basis.
yeah, yeah. No, I think it's a great.
Other than the link between smoking and cancer, is there an enormous kind of correlation between cause and effect? And therapy is just like that, right? We have a modest attempt at making modest effects in someone's life, and that as you said before, that can sound on the one hand pretty rubbish, but actually we in the industry need to make a bigger effort to sell that, because that can make massive differences to individual lives.
Yeah, I think if you're working with somebody who is, willing, able, motivated, then that's for me, that's the kicker. So often I'll see people and they're not quite at that point. It's not, they're not actually going to be able to make use of things. And other people come super ready. They were ready before they step through the door. There's really not much magic that I'm bringing to it. They are just in the market for change. They've hit rock bottom, or they're super motivated to do a thing. And I think that is a big part of it as well with those kind of surgical interventions. Often the kicker is, are you going to do your rehab? So if you're coming out of a hip operation and you don't much fancy doing the rehab, you're going to end up struggling to walk. You're going to end up having a real ongoing battle with walking. That wasn't because the surgery wasn't effective. It's probably because you went in not terribly fit, not terribly able to bear pain or understand the pain in your body, because you haven't really moved in that way, not habituated to a set of exercises. And I do have sympathy for that position, but like, you have to join that activity, you have to do the work, or even if you feel wobbly and it's scary. And I think that's the bit of therapy. It's like there's a limit. You can take a horse to water. There's a limit, to what we're doing in 50 minutes a week. What are there, 167 hours in a week, I think, from memory.
Yeah.
It's a small input or intervention, unless you're leaving therapy reflecting on that, taking away something to do, practicing it, getting it wrong, coming back, fine tuning, recalibrating, going again with that kind of determination that you would need if you were going to change your body shape or
Yeah.
your fitness in the gym. Or
And if you bring that into the world of relationships, in the same way that most of us have a default place in terms of the big five personality indicators that we return to more easily, and it requires quite a lot of work to shift the dial on those, each of those indicators a little bit. I think the same is probably true of relationships, isn't it? That you're going to be happy to or content to a certain degree in your relationship, and it's not going to shift enormously away from its default place with any kind of intervention from couples therapy. You're going to nudge the dial a little bit in a certain direction,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
probably.
Yeah,
And
yeah, yeah, yeah. I think that's right. The book that you were talking about earlier is all about small changes, right? What's the smallest thing you can do to generate change? And I'm often thinking of that myself when I'm with couples, and
yeah,
kind of sort of solution focused therapy, for what it's worth, is also asking, and when can we stop? It's like looking to stop as soon as possible, which is quite a nice way, I think, of framing therapy. And I think it's what couples are doing anyway. As we said at the start, they're looking at like, when is this enough? It's expensive and it's time consuming, and therapy isn't necessarily that enjoyable.
but
So,
quite, it's worth pausing on that though, because that is against the grain of therapeutic culture, which is more past orientated and more about slowing things down and taking our time. And actually we don't want to move too quickly, because we don't want to overwhelm anyone, and
yeah,
this deserves space. I mean, you mentioned safe spaces, this idea of space and room to breathe. Whereas solution focused work and couples work is often about the present and the future. It's often about
Yeah,
let's worry less about how you got yourself into this cycle. Let's focus much more on tweaking
yeah,
what's going on right now.
yeah.
Even the work on attachment styles can be helpful, but actually can take up a lot of time focused on the past rather than nailing kind of, well, what are we going to do with that?
In our old trade, it's sort of in government and politics, it's called admiring the problem, isn't it? You know, the problem is very, very difficult. It's vast. It's got multiple component parts, moving parts, and everyone is admiring the problem. It's like, what are we going to do about it? What's the action? Like, what are the series of things
Yeah.
might be
Yeah.
worth
I think
experimenting
you've just
with?
described most non-fiction books as well, haven't you? Like here's 200 pages on the problem and 10 pages on potential solution.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I agree with that. So the solution focused approach is thinking about how the pattern endures, how the problem pattern endures. It's worth knowing that how it endures,
Yeah.
but that's not why. It's
And
not.
that's where, say, like attachment styles would come in, right? So you've got different attachment styles, you've got different reactions to stress. You react defensively when under pressure, another person falls in on themselves when under pressure. That's the kind of why does this persist
Yeah,
part of the
yeah,
diagnosis, right?
yeah, absolutely. And then what needs to change, not why. So how is this happening, and what do we need to do differently? And that's not to be glib about it, or even to move
Mm,
through that quickly. You
mm,
could. And I think people who are interested in why it came about, I'm interested in that too, in my life and in other
right.
people's life. I think that's a legitimate aspect of therapy, but I think it's massively overdone in therapy culture. And I don't think it's always necessary. You can have a really detailed understanding of why you become incredibly angry and why you've got a hair trigger temper, but that won't help, that will not unlock the thing for you. Insight alone, I don't think there is a shred of evidence that that does really very much for you if you don't then follow it up with intention and effort and behavioral change.
Mm, I agree.
So they sort of in the book they say something like that it's a bit like math. Math doesn't really ask why. Mathematical statements probably or best understood as interrelated elements of a system. And then if you take that as read, it all kind of makes sense within itself. But the sort of why of things is almost the wrong question or not the most interesting question. It doesn't get you onto how to solve those kind of puzzles. They also say, which I think is worth saying on this podcast, and I say it to couples, not every difficulty is a problem, right? So some
Mm,
things are just difficult. Like, we've got different stances, haven't we? You and your wife have a different basic personality. Like that will cause you an ongoing difficulty. Whether or not you can do anything about that in terms of problem resolution, I think is to some extent doubtful. The classic example might be something like insomnia. Very few people suffer from insomnia. Lots of people suffer from sleepless nights occasionally, and you can turn that into insomnia if you keep worrying about it and you change your bedtime and you go to bed early that night because you absolutely must get a good night's sleep this night, and then you concentrate on doing that and thereby deny yourself of the very thing you want. And then if you worry and start thinking
mm,
about that a lot and you do that over time, you've taken an ordinary difficulty which occurs in almost everybody's life on a you know reasonably regular basis, and you've turned it into an almighty problem. So some of what I'm saying in couples therapy as well is that I think this is a difficulty. You
uh-huh.
prefer to do the dishes after you've eaten and before you watch a show, and you prefer to eat, relax immediately on the sofa and watch a show and do them at the end of the evening or the following day.
Yeah, and the mistake that you might be making in that situation is making the other person feel like they're doing it wrong. So you're trying to persuade or you're trying to make someone feel bad for not being as focused on cleanliness as you are.
Yeah,
And I agree with you that rather than seeing that about you don't care enough for me to clean the
yeah,
dishes when I want you to, I
yeah.
think trying to frame it more about actually this is just different people doing different things. Don't try and change that too much. I think
So
could be
yeah,
helpful.
someone gets called a slob, don't they? Someone gets
Yeah.
called neurotic or like
Yeah,
a neat freak or whatever, and
yeah.
we've gone to insults, and then to make our point, we'll add something else on. And you do this in another context, and you're like this, and your sister said you were like this, and something along those lines. And it's like, oh wow, we've completely lost. We could
Yeah.
have a perfectly pleasant evening, and instead we've had a go at one another about something relatively trivial. So the idea that you could work your way through that or dissolve that problem, I mean, it's a difficulty, right? you're going to have to trade or take turns, or find some sort of resolution to that. But
Yeah.
it to some extent, those things are relatively unimportant. Difficulties, not problems. Like some of that we can coexist with.
Yeah,
Caring with.
and I'd say we're back in the arena of modest changes, in the sense that most people in relationships, in my experience, don't want their partner to move all the way towards them. They want minor kind of moves in their direction. So if you've got an extrovert and an introvert, and one person wants more kind of partying and wants more nights out, a
Yeah,
little bit of effort from the other partner goes an awful long way in terms of signaling that I'm trying hard. So if we take the issue of cleanliness, right, and washing the dishes, a little bit of effort, not all the way towards where the other person is. You don't have to become that other person. I think just a little bit of like, I get that this is important to you and I'm going to go a little out of my comfort zone. I think that goes a really long way in relationship.
yeah, I agree. I agree. Yeah, I think the other adjustment is around expectations. So partly where where we started out as well. Like, why is the expectation that we won't have a different view on cleanliness or dishes, or how often we party, or how often we go out, or what we save and what we spend, or where we go on holiday? Like, why would that be completely and utterly agreed always and forever? Like, it's nuts, right, to think that way. And I think sometimes psychotherapy can, at its worst, can be a bit utopian. Sort of, it goes along with the idea that we should have these wonderfully fulfilling, rich lives. And it's like, well, maybe, I'm not so sure. And I think if you're wired a certain way and you've got a certain personality type, I'm not sure you will necessarily have those
Yeah,
feelings.
and I'd add a layer on top of that. I think that a lot of couples therapy suggests that those differences that you just talked about, we were talking about, that you should reconcile those things, that you should resolve those things within a relationship. So the idea of like, you should speak your truth, you should articulate that that bothers you in a relationship. And if your partner can't
Yeah.
hear that and can't respond to it, then you're in the wrong relationship. And I think that's a fallacy. I think what you're talking about there are two people that can't ever be the same as each other, nor ultimately would you want to be in a relationship with someone who is exactly the same as you. And the idea that you should try to reconcile those differences and talk about everything as if it is a problem to solve, I think is a potential pitfall for couples.
Yeah, it's you're also taking us back to the idea of self there, aren't you? You could put yourself and your preferences to one
Yep.
side in that instance. You could do what the other person wants. And what often you find in those instances, if you kind of love one another and have a basic respect for one another, then the other person will meet you pretty much halfway. There'll be another night where they do it from your point of view and they prefer that I think is the sweet spot, isn't it? But I think what it requires is someone, ideally both of you, to go first and say, like, my preference here is just that. It's a preference, and it's not the end of the world, and it's not a character assassination of you. I would just like it, but I can also put it to one side. I can retire it, all of the things worth worrying about or thinking about or getting in a stew about in the world, that probably isn't so important. And I think therapy at its worst can lock on to those things. It very much matters. It's got deep symbolism. It stands for this. And it's like, does it? Could you just retire it? Could you be a bit
Yeah. Yeah.
easier to live with?
Yeah.
To be a
There's
pleasure to live with? Could you make that your goal? When you date someone, that's what you're showing them, aren't you? Your best side, the bit that's really likable. And the reason that goes right and you fall in love is because you're making an effort. And the reason it goes wrong, I often contrast for couples how they started and where they are now, and they are behaving very differently. And it's like, well, that's the maths, that's the equation, isn't it? That's what's happening here. It didn't drop from the sky. You didn't catch disappointment or lack of fulfillment from the water supply. It's like you're behaving like this towards one another.
There's that old Warren Buffett quote, you can always tell your boss to go to hell tomorrow. Like, you don't
Yeah.
need to prioritize your feelings in the moment. Sleep
Yeah.
on it. Just take a step back. You're probably doing that job because you need to put bread on the table for your family. It's not all about your self-actualization.
Yeah.
Pause. You can always
Yeah.
tell him to go to hell tomorrow.
Yeah. No, it's nice, isn't it? That the book we were talking about, the All or Nothing Marriage, I think in the last podcast, it's got
Mm,
a little bit of that utopian
mm,
sort of tilt for me. He says something in there, I've scribbled it down, acknowledging, like, he's very good, I think, at acknowledging the problem of diminished time within relationships nowadays. Often two people working, challenge of families being a bit more
Yeah, I was
dispensed.
listening to how increased the time has become that men and women focus on their children compared to even 20 years ago. It's
Yeah,
the number of hours that we in relationships are giving to our children has gone up almost exponentially. It's crazy how
yeah.
high that's gone up.
Yeah, 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 yeah. They used to work in the fields, didn't they? Or go up chimneys or be in the
Yeah,
factories. They were our labor force, and now they're our overlords, and we run around after them. But yes, they're generally that point about diminished
yeah,
time. You're good at acknowledging that, what you've just said there, jobs and whatever else, and often not much help from extended family who are a bit further afield than they would have been in previous times. But still, he casts it as in that all marriage, if you're going after that, the very best quote unquote version of marriage, you are helping each other feel optimally loved, I think is the phrase, and you're promoting each other's self-expression. That's your task. And it feels to me massively overinflated. I mean, I've sort of picked that phrase out, I suppose, to make it sound a bit ridiculous, but to me, it sounds a bit ridiculous. To the couples I see, I'm like, are we really going after that? But I do think couples therapy sometimes goes there as well, that we will feel deep, profound love for one another. This process will get you back to that connection that maybe you had at the
yeah,
start. And I
yeah.
doubt it, to be honest. I think it can get you something good, but I think that would be easily good enough. And the point at which you settle, if you've got busy family life, there will not be that much time for you, and it won't feel like it did when you were in your 20s or 30s.
Exactly. That's a fool's errand, I think, to try and chase the feeling when you're 45 that you had when you were 25. I think it's a crazy it's a crazy goal to try and work back towards. I think couples therapists often talk about kind of what connected you to. Let's rekindle that
Yeah,
feeling.
sure.
Let's rekindle that. Let's remind ourselves of why we fell in love. And I don't think either that that's the route towards
Yeah,
uh, rekindling anything. I think it's like about how do we create something new given the context and the circumstances you're in and the people that you now are as well.
yeah. What I quite liked about the previous book on solution focused therapy is that they talk about how ready we are to see marriages and our own marriage as problematic rather than all marriages have problems, and that's some of what I am saying to the couples I see. All marriages have problems, and you could dissolve this one. You could each set up shop with someone else, but that too, that relationship too would have a problem really fairly soon into it. You might get through the first 2 weeks, 2 months, even 2 years if you're lucky, but this will come up. Like, we are not identikit people. We don't feel the same way about everything. We've got different levels of energy and challenge. Life comes and goes, and stuff will hit you, and it will be there will be something which is difficult to talk about, something on which you clash, something on which you disagree, which doesn't need to be, it sometimes could be, but it doesn't need to be the basis for a separation or for great drama.
Good. Anything more from the book that you really wanted to draw on before we finish up?
No, I think that might be about it. Maybe one more thing, which is I think you could settle for a change of behavior rather than change of attitude. Often people are looking for an attitudinal change from their partner, that they change their attitude towards cleanliness
Interesting.
or
Yeah.
timekeeping. And I think it's probably worth saying that, like, if they struggle with timekeeping, it's just not been their thing. It's not their thing across multiple domains, and they work really hard on that and improve it substantially for you. That'll do. Take the win. Like, that's the deal. That's
Yeah, I think that signals an intention, though. I think it's hard to differentiate between the two on the receiving end. I think to the receiving party, that does feel like a shift in intention, that you're thinking like, I've been told that this is important to my partner. I'm going to make a conscious effort to show them that I can behave differently. And
yeah.
I think that often does get received in a really profound way that
Yeah,
says,
yeah, yeah.
you
Yeah, no,
understand.
that's a nice counter. I think I recognize that would happen. So sometimes I think people, like, I want you to want to do it, and
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
sometimes
yeah,
that
yeah.
sometimes that
I agree with that. Yeah.
sometimes that goes a bit wrong. And I guess what I see sometimes talking to other therapists a little bit in supervision setting, that the sometimes our goals for clients, for people coming to therapy, are pretty high. That we're looking at really something like wholesale change, or we're accepting from clients something which is unrealistic. And I suppose what I think I bring is I'm going to challenge that. I'm going to wonder whether that's achievable and in your best interest. In the book, I think they say the phrase is something like, your job as the therapist is to limit the complaint against vague vastness. So often people will come to me and there'll be a sort of vague vastness of what they
Mm.
want to change, and we might need to drill down and decide
I'm
what
not
the most.
feeling loved anymore, for
Yeah,
example. Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. And it's like, okay, what would that, I know you know this, but
Mm.
what would that look like? What would the
Yeah.
behavior be? If you were to
Yeah.
get that outcome, tomorrow morning it would look like that. The weekend it would look like that. Life would change in these ways. What would start? What would stop? And putting some specification on that, I suppose, is some of what I would see as genuinely helpful to couples rather than.
I think that can be really hard for someone to really have a proper think about what that would look like and what
Yeah.
that might feel like as well.
Yeah, because I think you would be leaving some stuff out, right? You're forcing them to think hard about, realistically, what would this look like
Yeah.
for anyone, and what would it look
That,
like?
but that is where
Well,
you start to get quite modest responses. What you don't say is, "Well, I want massive, grand, romantic gestures, and I want him to suddenly transform his personality." It's like once in a while, I'd quite like him to give a
yeah,
shit. I've just walked in through the front door. Things
yeah.
like that.
Yeah, absolutely. What it'll often turn into is, on Thursday, I'd like you to try and get home by 7 at the latest, and
Yeah,
then we could have dinner together, which I'll
nice.
prepare. And it's like, oh wow, it wasn't maybe so hard after all. And what I think is lovely about this work is when the other person is like really happy and willing to do so. That's not a huge problem for them. They maybe weren't coming home because they hadn't realized, or often it descends into conflict. So might as well just stay for a bit longer, or go for a drink, or skip bedtime because it's always a bit fraught or whatever. You get somewhere that is modest, that's doable, but is, I don't know whether we're saying transformational or not, but it is transformational in that sense, and it's really modest and humdrum in another sense.
Well, if any listeners or viewers have any suggestions for ways we can make modest improvements to the podcast, let us know. We're contactable at crazy in love podcast UK@gmail.com. Good
I
stuff.
can't imagine that eventuality.
Modest improvements. See you soon, Matt.
Yeah, nice to see you.